Good afternoon and welcome to the Knowledge Series. My name is Matt Higgins and I'm the State Manager, Development and Partnerships for Queensland at Creative Australia. Thank you for joining us for the fourth instalment of the Knowledge Series in 2025. We're absolutely thrilled to be joined today by a very special guest, Kevin L. Brown, for his session to get funding, be fundable and findable. To begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathering today. I'm dialing in from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people here in Meanjin, Brisbane, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend this to the traditional custodians of the land from which you're joining today. I'd also like to acknowledge my brilliant First Nations colleagues at Creative Australia and acknowledge all of the First Nations folks who are joining us today. I'd also like to introduce you to our Auslan interpreters who are supporting today's session. A big warm welcome to our interpreters Alana and Bella for helping ensure this space is inclusive and accessible. Now, before we dive in, I would like to take a moment to set the tone and do a little bit of housekeeping for how we'll engage together today. We are recording today's session, so please remain on mute with your cameras off throughout the session. For any technical issues, please direct message Paulina from our private investment capability team in the chat. Now, throughout the session, there'll be several points where Kevin will invite audience input, ideas and reactions, not just during a Q&A at the end, but scattered throughout the session. So it's helpful for all of us to get familiar with how we will participate. So I'd invite you now to take a moment to locate the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It's usually toward the center of the toolbar. Now, just to note, the chat box is disabled, but this Q&A button is where you'll be able to drop your responses, comments, thoughts, and questions throughout the session. Kevin L. Brown is here to help us unpack what it really takes to unlock funding. In his words, to get funding, you need to be findable and fundable. Today's conversation will explore why fundraising alone won't fix your fundraising challenges, why brand must come first, and what it really takes to become visible and compelling to funders. Kevin is the CEO of Mighty Ally, a not-for-profit hybrid consultancy that helps organizations build brand clarity to maximize funding. Their work spans theory of change, strategic planning, positioning, and marketing communications, all delivered through their powerful, fundable, findable framework. Kevin's roots are in the advertising agency world, where he helped his first four companies scale to acquisition. He's founded two businesses, is an Acumen Fellow, advises two grant makers, and creates daily for more than 82,000 followers on LinkedIn. Over the past decade, he's lived and worked across Uganda, South Africa, Mauritius, Malaysia, advocating for social justice and helping organisations across the global south sharpen their brand and amplify their impact. And just last month, Kevin released his new book, Fundable and Findable, which has already become an Amazon bestseller in 4 different categories. And on a personal note, when I started in this role 18 months ago, my colleague Hannah Kothi, who many of you working across South Australia and the Northern Territory will know, first introduced me to Kevin's work while we were trading links we loved on LinkedIn. I signed up to his brilliant newsletter, which at the time was daily. Coming from a marketing background myself, I was completely hooked. Every morning I'd check my inbox and find myself having genuine light bulb moments and finding insights that reshaped the way that I was thinking about impact, communication, and storytelling. And that experience wasn't just mine. The whole team here at Creative Australia found huge value in Kevin's thinking. So much so that we just knew we had to find a way for everyone to hear from him directly. And clearly that sentiment was shared because this session has received the highest number of registrations in the history of the Knowledge Series. No pressure, Kevin. So with that, please join me in giving a very big, warm welcome to Kevin L. Brown. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Matt. Geez, what a great introduction. I don't know that I'm going to be able to top that, but I'll do my very best. All right. So yeah, thank you for that awesome welcome, Matt. Thanks for Creative Australia for having me. Good morning to those of you in WA. You're on the same time zone as me. I think it's just still morning here, 11:30 a.m. and good afternoon to the rest of you in the country. So I think Matt covered the topic for today's knowledge series: to get funding, be fundable and findable. But before we dive into the actual content, I want to do a quick mood check. So as Matt said, this is not going to be just a one-way presentation. Definitely don't love those as much as having kind of two-way dialogue. And so, as Matt said, you can use the Q&A box to make sure that we're chatting and making this as interactive as possible. So, the first thing we're going to do before we even get into the content is a quick mood check. And I want you to tell me in the Q&A, which Beyonce are you feeling today? What's your Beyonce mood? So you can just say 1 through 12 and let me know what you think. So Liz is a 6. Thank you, Liz. We have Finn, who's a 9. Lucy is an 8. Gitta is a 6. We have a few 6s. Chris is an 8. All right. Don't think we have any 11s or 12s yet. Oh, we have a 12. Thanks, Mark. Mark is feeling the 12. If we could get you on camera and get you to explain that one, I'd love to hear that story. Yeah, 4s and 2s. Thanks, Aaron. We do have an 11. Thank you, Shannon. We got an 11. Feeling a bit frizzy today. That's awesome. And we got another 12 from Corinna. This is awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, lots of great answers. I think we have nearly every single one covered. Ooh, we've got 2 people, Omar and Jenna. We've got a 4 in the room with Gemma, who's an 11. So we've got 2 people balancing the energy. We've got the stealth 4 mood balancing the frizzy 11 mood. So awesome. That's great. Thanks for that. That's just a little kickoff to get us in the mood for today, and also getting us to use the Q&A feature, because again, we want to be using that throughout the day. So for me, if you asked what my mood is today, I'm a number 1. So I'm a number 1. I'm feeling just super happy to be here, just super content to be here, because I actually started my career in the arts. So many years ago, my first few jobs out of university were all in the arts. So over on the left-hand side, you'll see me in the back row throwing up the rock signal. This was at Lollapalooza, one of the most legendary music tours in history. So my first real job in the arts was working with live music, and I lived in Austin, Texas. It's the live music capital of the world, and we produced Lollapalooza. We produced Austin City Limits, one of the longest running arts programs on public broadcasting. So the TV show, the music festival over there on the right, a lot of just awesome moments like many of you here, living and breathing the arts. Then we were acquired by Live Nation, obviously one of the world's biggest arts producers. I lived in Nashville, worked with artists and bands for a company that ended up being owned by Ticketmaster, another major arts producer. And then also started my own company with a few people, and we worked with like the legendary Ryman Auditorium and wine and food events. And so this was my start, but long before I really got into this nonprofit world, was trying to figure out how to drive funding for arts organizations. And ultimately, though, the orphan crisis kind of led me to the nonprofit world. So if you ask about my personal why, why I'm here, why I'm fighting for nonprofits like you all and causes like you all, it's my daughters. I have 2 daughters from Uganda and a daughter from China, and really in that process, I realized a few things. Number one, there's just some inequality and poverty and injustice in the world that obviously is not okay, and I felt personally like I had a privilege and a responsibility to try to do something about it. And then more importantly, there are a lot of amazing organizations in the world already tackling these causes, these issues, whether it's arts or hunger or education, right? There are, by some estimates, 10 million nonprofits in the world that are already fighting these challenges. And so that's when we really started Mighty Ally. And I quickly realized, even though there are 10 million nonprofits in the world, most of us are unseen, unheard, and underfunded. I don't know if that feels familiar to any of you, but I'll stop there and you can put a quick emoji in the Q&A again. Does that feel familiar? This idea of your organization being underfunded or at times feeling unseen, maybe to donors or government partners, or sometimes being unheard, whether you post on social media or try to launch a campaign. Does that feel familiar? Unseen, unheard, and underfunded. So thank you. We've got Carrie saying, yes, exclamation point. Desley, absolutely. Amy, yes. Melinda, definitely, exclamation point. Yeah, absolutely familiar. Oh, yeah, yep. Too real, totally, yep. Yes, definitely, very familiar indeed. Ooh, D, thank you for sharing this one. Invisible and underappreciated. That's all too real and all too sad, right? We're all doing some of the world's most important work. So thank you for this. Yeah, no time, under-resourced, a lot of good comments here. So thank you for that. So I actually realized this, and this realization struck me while I was on death row in Kenya. So I was there conducting field study in a dozen prisons alongside a struggling nonprofit leader. He had just experienced a series of fundraising failures and honestly had just received a harsh but true rejection from a major donor. And so this was really the first moment I realized, wow, this is not okay, right? Too many organizations unseen, unheard, underfunded, underappreciated. And so before I tell you what that high net worth said, I'm pretty sure most of you here can resonate with that idea of being rejected by a donor, right? When I do this keynote talk in auditoriums, I'll say, raise your hand if you've ever been rejected by a donor. And honestly, sometimes I even share some of those donor rejection stories in the audience, and many of them can be harsh. Sometimes they can be funny, but all too often they're too true, right? I think over and over again, too many of us are constantly rejected by donors. And so back to that nonprofit leader in Kenya and in Uganda. So after a fundraising pitch, this major donor flat out told him, no, because your brand is shit. And so if anyone can beat that donor rejection, you can let me know in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll try to figure out a way to buy you a drink virtually. Really harsh rejection. We can laugh about it now, but sadly, this nonprofit was doing some of the world's most important work. They were working with people in some of the world's worst prisons. So these were people that often had not been convicted of a crime. These are people who often had no lawyer, who often waited for years in crowded prison cells without a trial. And then these same people learned to defend themselves and others in court. So I visited their work in 8 prisons. That's what the first picture was. I listened to people on death row. And on death row, there were literally women with their babies who were growing up behind bars. And this charity, it wasn't all doom and gloom. They were creating such an impact that even the prison guards, like this student, so even the prison guards started joining the program to legally represent those they guarded. It was just remarkable. And I'd never seen anything like it, right? You had prison guards studying alongside people in prison to try to defend themselves in court. It was just absolutely remarkable. But the reality was this nonprofit couldn't raise enough money to stay alive, much less grow. So after witnessing the remarkable work of tons of organizations like this and tons of organizations like yours, but then seeing the unremarkable fundraising results, something just didn't click, right? You had remarkable work, but unremarkable fundraising results. Many of you said in the chat, yes, unseen, unheard, underfunded. Like, how is this happening? And then I started looking into it and stumbled upon the term, the nonprofit starvation cycle. You can look it up if you want, but it essentially just means that most of us are just in that rat race, that hamster wheel. We're raising just enough money to pay the bills, just enough money to put on our festivals or our performances or our concert series or to serve the children, whatever we're doing, we're barely bringing on enough money to pay our teams. And it's just this never ending cycle, right? And I think many of us feel like we're stuck in that funding. And so if you're feeling that today, just to make sure you are not alone. You are certainly not alone. In fact, according to the Australian Charities Report, they kind of define small charities of annual revenue of less than 250,000 Australian dollars, medium charities of between 250 and a million, and large charities of over a million. And so you look at this, and sometimes it's common for us in the small charity world to feel like we're just fighting against the behemoths. We're fighting against the big nonprofits, the big arts organizations, those that are getting all the big government funding. But at the end of the day, though, even in Australia, the data shows that 65% of charities are small, 16% are medium, and only roughly 19% are large. So most of us in this knowledge series today are considered small. And then even further than that, if you break it down even further, it's quite remarkable to see that there's even this category of 1/3 extra small, right, with revenue of less than 50,000 Australian dollars. And so you are not alone. And if you do think possibly that, hey, this is a uniquely Australian problem, you might feel, hey, we're a bit isolated, right? We don't have access to the same donors sometimes that organizations maybe in North America and Europe can access. And hey, maybe there's a higher percentage of high net worths in other countries. And yes, the data shows that most like foundations are in North America and Europe. That is true. But it is important to illustrate, again, not only are you not alone in Australia, but you're not alone even throughout the world. We look at a lot of data coming out of the States that talk about how many will really grow beyond a small business, which even in the United States terms, small business is considered $50 million or less per year in budget. And that's, that's still considered roughly a small business. So let's pretend that there are 1,000 people on this Zoom call, on this knowledge series. If there were 1,000 people here, I want you to guess how many of us, if there were 1,000, would break beyond that small business size, would break beyond that measure. Is it half of us that would reach beyond a small business? Maybe is it 10% of us? I think many of our minds might go there. But again, even in the United States, only 1 in 1,000 nonprofits will grow beyond a small business. That's it. It's quite remarkable. In fact, even in the United States, 88% of nonprofits survive on less than 500,000 US dollars per year. And so when you, and then, you take that evidence further. So 88% less than 500,000, only 9% between 500,000 and 5 million. And even in the United States, only 3% of nonprofits break 5 million in annual budget. So you take the Australian data that I showed you, you take this US evidence, and it really does just reinforce this idea. The data is damning, and it's painfully obvious that too many nonprofits are too small. So if too many are too small, I think at this point, I always ask, can we all agree that something about our fundraising system is not working, right? So nonprofit leaders like all of us and our fundraisers and our teams we're burning out at record rates. That's one of the biggest issues in our field is this, the burnout. We're trying to raise enough money to serve our causes. We're trying to raise enough money to serve our communities, to serve our patrons, but at many times we come up short. So I think that's something we have to just wrestle with in this fundraising ecosystem is if too many nonprofits are too small, something, year after year is broken, and we have to look extra hard at that. Not to mention, just to pour a little salt in the wound, in the arts world, it's extra difficult, right? So this is a quote from Jeff Brooks. He's a prominent fundraising expert, and he says, arts fundraising has a special challenge that other fundraisers don't face. When you donate to the arts, you don't necessarily save lives, right? And so he goes on to say, of course, you might argue that it's not as necessary as saving lives. And he says, don't get me wrong. He says, quote, I know the arts are necessary for a meaningful and civilized life, and they help people in meaningful ways. But he says, but the main reason people donate is not to the arts is not to help other people. They do it to serve themselves. And they want to make sure that art form they love stays available, he says. Many are motivated by donor benefits that enhance their experience with the arts. And so he kind of talks about this challenge that arts fundraising faces. And I'm thinking back to my first few jobs out of university and thinking about driving funding for the causes and the arts that I mentioned earlier. Not to mention, you have this brand that has to appeal to both sides. You're often selling a ticket to a customer, right? You're selling an experience to a customer. And then at the same time, you're often going and raising money. Sometimes they're the same, but often they're not. And so I think that's the big nuance in this world is sometimes the actual customer, especially like if you're serving children in an underserved community with the arts, oftentimes the customer, the beneficiary, so to speak, is not the actual payer. And so on that note, before we move on, I do want to say that today's talk is a little bit more focused on that other side. So this is not as much that B2C consumer marketing focus. Today's talk is a little bit about that other side. It's the trusts and foundations. It's the institutional donors, maybe government donors, corporate donors. Since most of our work at Mighty Ally really skews to that world versus kind of the customer-facing donor marketing. That's what most of this talk is going to be focused on. But I really do hope that you can learn a lot from our model and learn a lot from these other sectors. Just like Matt said, I think a lot of people within Creative Australia have already been enjoying the content. And so again, hopefully you'll be able to kind of benefit from this framework. All right, so I've spelled a little bit of doom and gloom. We've talked about the pain points. I think many of you are feeling and nodding in the Q&A, yes, this feels resonant. And so here's the good news. After all the doom and gloom, there is a solution to this nonprofit starvation cycle. Our own nonprofit, Mighty Ally, so we're, again, a nonprofit ourselves. We were once in that nonprofit starvation cycle too. We struggled to raise money early on, just like many of us here are still doing today. Then we made a discovery. We grew like crazy. We attracted donors, prominent global funders such as Cartier Philanthropy. We implemented this discovery with more than, I think at this point, 340 clients in 50 countries. And then I was even invited to sit on the board of a couple of foundations like grant makers. And so I've started to see this issue from two sides. Here's what we figured out. The name of this talk and what we're going to talk about today is to get funding, be fundable and findable. A nonprofit doesn't maximize its funding by just hiring more development staff, filling out more grant applications, seeking more awards, or creating more donor prospect lists. Just like Matt said earlier, and what we say throughout our work and in my book, more fundraising itself can't fix your fundraising. You must build your brand first and worry about funding second. So to be clear, it's not a competition between brand and fundraising. I would never say that to a room full of fundraisers. Both are critical. Both brand and fundraising are critical, and they're inseparable, right? So it's not about the order of importance. It's about the order of operations, because brand is the soil and fundraising is the seeds. Brand is the engine. Fundraising is the fuel. Brand is your aspiration. Fundraising is the realization. Brand is the foundation, fundraising the roof, and brand is your differentiation. Fundraising is the monetization. And so I know some of you, especially if you maybe come from an arts background, or many times we get this in the social sector, like with maybe a health professional or an academic, they despise the idea of brand. Sometimes that word brand gives them the capitalistic creeps, but that sentiment isn't helping your cause, because many leaders think that brand is maybe a private sector thing. Maybe that brand makes us compete with our nonprofit and arts peers. People might think that brand doesn't apply to small organizations, or that brand is too expensive, or brand is all about design or creative campaigns. And some people think, hey, brand shouldn't matter if the work is good, if the art is good. Yet none of those things is true. Here's what is true. You have a brand, whether you like it or not. Really, the only choice you have is how actively you want to shape and manage that brand. So if your funding has stalled, which many of you admitted earlier, possibly, if your funding has stalled, I always say, if you're not growing, stop what you're doing. Stop the old school fundraising rat race, gather your leadership team, and don't leave the room until you're fundable and findable before anything else. So in this knowledge series talk, I'm going to teach you how to be fundable and then how to be findable with 3 laws each. I'll even give you a couple of exercises to start working on your brand. And then about that nonprofit in Kenya, what about that leader that got the harsh rejection? How did they go from the brink of insolvency to raising millions of dollars in a matter of months, including a feature on America's #1 news program? I'll tell you at the end. So let's dive in. Before we dive in, any questions so far? I got a question from Carrie Ann. Where are you again? I think you're meaning physically in the world. I currently live in Malaysia. So I'm on GMT 8 time zone with Western Australia today. Any questions so far? Go ahead and pop them in. All right. Nothing yet. Oh, Paul. Paul says, nailed the brand angle. So misunderstood. Proud to come from a branding design background, so totally agree. Thank you for that, Paul. Yeah. Yeah, brand is often misunderstood. It sometimes is even miscategorized as the branding. Kim, great question from Kim. Thank you. Define brand. Brand is the intersection of what you want people in the world to believe and feel about your organization to what they actually do feel about your organization. And so brand is a little bit intangible, right? It's almost like I describe it as the soul of a person. If someone said, "Hey, Kim, describe your soul," you would have to really dig deep and talk about, what you stand for and your views and how you act and how you look, right? So brand can almost be thought of like a person. Brand can be thought of as a human that has those deep core inner beliefs, but also it's more than just the inner stuff. It's the outward stuff. It's how you talk. It's how you walk. It's how you dress. And so that's the interesting part about a brand is it's one part internal and one part external. Tony says the Q&A is working for some of us. Don't think, but Tony, we got your Q&A, so feel free, keep it coming. And then, yeah, great question. When I say stop and reevaluate, of course, not literally stop your fundraising, but stop long enough to meet and define your brand and figure out what it means to be fundable and findable. Of course, don't miss tomorrow's deadline for a grant application, but stop doing things the old way, right? I think that's definitely just the thesis of this talk is something is broken, something is not working. We have to tackle the problem differently. All right, thanks for these questions. Please keep them coming, but let's dive in the interest of time. So be fundable, the first part of today's Knowledge Series talk. Being fundable means to show donors why you exist, what you do, where you're going, who will do it, how to get there, and when it will be done. So being fundable is your brand as well, and that can fix your fundraising. And so there are three main laws of being fundable. The first law of being fundable is that a pitch without a problem is a problem. And so the next time a donor asks what you do, whether it's a high net worth or a government partner or any donor that you're talking to, when they ask what you do, don't actually start what you do. So the same goes for your elevator pitch, your website homepage, or if you have a pitch deck or a piece of collateral, because a problem statement is the initial most powerful step in your fundraising communications. Reason being, donors must understand the issue before they can care about your solution. They need to lean in, they need to be invested. So I didn't make this up. This psychology dates back 200,000 years to cave people. Really, humans are wired to listen to something for how they can either thrive or survive. Again, this dates back to prehistoric times. Think about every book you've ever read or movie you've watched. There's always tension or drama. So the trick is here, when you're communicating about your cause, your arts, your organization, never open with we language. So never when you're speaking or writing, always start with that problem. And trust me, I get it. It's hard to break that habit, right? When we teach this lesson in our training courses, we will ask leaders, so tell us about either the social problem or the arts, the problem that you address. And people's natural reaction is, well, we do this and that. And we will say, but what's the actual problem? Is there an issue you're trying to solve in your community? And they will say, well, our work focuses on this and that, but the data says you've already lost the donor at that point. So here's the right way to do it. If a donor asks me, hey, Kevin, tell me about Mighty Ally, I would answer like this. You know how too many nonprofits are too small and struggle with fundraising? Well, only 1 in 1,000 will grow beyond a small business. That's why so did you notice the small nuance, but the big difference there? That's the deal. Always lead with that problem statement in your communications. because that first law of being fundable is that a pitch without a problem is a problem. Second law of being fundable is that complicated missions complicate fundraising. And so here's a reality check for all of us. No matter the sector we're in, arts or hunger or poverty or education, the number one complaint we hear from donors, and again, all types of donors, the number one thing we hear is that they just don't understand what you do. We often use so much fluffy language in our communications that donors struggle to understand what is the thing, what is the program, what is the product. I actually sat across um, a brutal conversation at a funders annual conference. And so this was a conference where a lot of nonprofits and funders came together, and a grant maker was giving these two nonprofit leaders a chance to pitch her. And so these leaders kept rambling on and on with buzzwords, so incoherent buzzwords. They would talk about, well, holistic this and empowerment and transformation. And then she would say, well, can you tell me what you do? And they would say, well, innovative and award-winning and historic. And so finally she gave up, and she literally handed them her business card and said, if you think what you do matches with what we fund, check out our foundation's website and then you can get in touch. So ouch, right? It was just a brutal missed opportunity. And that's why we say that mission statements for any type of organization, mission statements have been butchered and confused and filled with buzzwords. This important tool has lost its way. There's a quote that we love from a prominent funder. He says, your first priority is to learn to clearly, concisely, and compellingly communicate what it is that you do. And this comes from a major foundation who's really obsessed with impact and measurement and all sorts of really key subjects like that. But at the end of the day, they say your first step is really brand clarity, being clear about what you do. And so that's the second law: focus your mission and then document it clearly. So the second law of being fundable is so focus your mission, document it clearly. The second law of being fundable is that complicated missions complicate fundraising. All right, I see a couple of good questions coming in. Let me get through the third law, and then we'll take a couple of questions at the end of this section. So thank you, Lucy and others. All right, number 3, the third and final law of being fundable is that you must sell donors on your vision, not just your cause. Reason being, for people to follow you and for funders to fund. And so this goes for your patrons, your customers, your funders. They must understand not only what you do, but also where you're going. And so the power of vision has been proven, in business literature. If you read any good books about organizational development or business, or, even just, successful technology companies, really across any field, like in the book Built to Last, they studied countless organizations and found that those with a clear vision outperform all the others by a factor of 12. But, a little bit more tough love in our nonprofit world, a lot of our vision statements don't come across as strong. They're a little bit weak, right? So sometimes we have these visions of maybe a world where, peace and rainbows, or where everyone reaches their full potential. It just doesn't have the teeth. Or maybe worse of all, a lot of times our visions can get mixed up with missions. And so maybe a government grant application or a high net worth donor says, what's the vision for this thing? And you give them the mission, and then it's maybe even a worse case because it's mixed up. And so here's a little visual to make sure we're communicating the right way. So if we think of your organization as kind of climbing a mountain, that's the cause, hopefully the grand vision ahead. Your problem or your reason for being, that's really why you're climbing the mountain in the first place. So most of us, either we started our own nonprofit organizations or we joined an organization. There's a problem or a why statement, a reason for being. That's generally why you're in this work in the first place, right? Then your vision is the mountaintop. That's where you want this to go. Those two things rarely change. Generally, as a nonprofit, you're fixed on why you exist and the reason for being, and then you're generally fixed on the vision, the grand vision ahead. Those two things rarely change, but your mission is more the path up the mountain. That's what you do to make it happen. That's your product, your program, your cause, your your arts, your concert series, whatever it is that you're actually selling or doing. That's the mission. And so perhaps you start up one side of the mountain and there are boulders or ice and you have to pick a different mission. That's okay. But again, the vision stays firm. And so we really love this idea of a vision, but we also love the idea you might have seen when communicating with donors, there's something you can look up called the big, hairy, audacious goal. Sometimes this BHAG can be even better than an old school vision statement. And we've all seen it. You know, you'll look at a nonprofit organization or an arts organization and they'll say, you know, by 2030, you know, we will reach millions of children, or, you know, we will have, you know, 100,000 patrons, right? These big lofty goals are plastered all over their communications, and donors love this type of audacious thinking. So consider maybe a vision statement can feel a little bit fluffy, but this idea of making your vision powerful and tangible, a BHAG could be that tool that, again, gives it a little bit of teeth. So the third and final law of being fundable is to sell donors on your vision, not just your cause. All right, so in summary, to be fundable, remember these three laws. A pitch without a problem is a problem. Complicated missions complicate fundraising. And then you must sell donors on your vision, not just your cause. Make it clear, don't be confusing. All right, let me do one quick exercise and we'll take a couple of questions. So how might you bring these three laws together? You know, obviously there's a lot more that goes into some of our, you know, fundraising communications, but we like this one sentence tool that you can use. It's considered a one sentence theory of change. And even again, if you're not a hunger or education organizations or poverty organization, you can use this tool. Think about how you would fill in this formula. Because why? This is that powerful statement. Why do you exist? What's the problem you're addressing? We work where? So this is the geographic focus of your mission. Is it across Australia? Is it a single city, right? Where are you working? Is it multiple places? That's something important for donors to know. To help who? These are the people you serve, your patrons, your community, your customers. Maybe it's not help. Maybe there's another word you use in there. What? This is that mission statement. What do you do? How? This is the 1 to 3 products or programs or interventions or pieces of your cause or your arts organization. In order to win. This is that BHAG we just discussed. Something about the vision, about the future, right? So that's the little formula. Feel free to take a screenshot, take a quick picture if you think this formula could help. We've probably done similar things in grade school: why, where, who, what, when, and how. But weaving these together can form a really powerful single sentence that really cuts through all the jargon and really gets to the heart of what your organization is all about. So here's an example from that Kenyan nonprofit I mentioned earlier. Because there can be no peace without justice and no justice without peace. That was their why. We work in East Africa. That's where. To help. And the people in prison refer to themselves as defenseless communities. We're lacking the defense system. Get a fair hearing in court. That was the what. How did they do it? They had 3 things: education, training, and practice. And when? What was it all about? It was elevating 1 million people in conflict with the law within 10 years. And so, sure, it's a long, clunky sentence, but it's not supposed to be public-facing messaging. This is a tool you can use internally with your team, as a leadership team, to really drive that internal brand clarity. Again, being fundable is all about, you know, what you are at the core, why you exist, what you do, and where you're going. And so if you can wrap that all up into a single sentence, it can be really powerful. All right, let's take some time for a couple of questions here.
Kevin, I'll jump in now. We've just got a
Please, yeah,
couple with
thank
a
you.
couple of variations on a common theme here from both Finn and Lucy. Finn's dropped into the chat. This is in relation to Law 1. A pitch without a problem is a problem.
Yep,
Finn is asking, but isn't a problem statement reinforcing a deficit model, especially when working with under-resourced communities? And Lucy's got a similar thought bubble there. They're curious about how the pitch without a problem is a problem. Principal works without using deficit language. Feedback
yep.
from historically marginalized communities is that they don't like being described in this way. And can we suggest how that principle works with alignment with that request?
Yep. Awesome questions. Thank you, Finn. Thank you, Lucy. And this is definitely a great question that comes up around this topic. And so, first things first, I would say, of course, always avoid deficit language. So that's just a core principle of all of our fundraising communications. And I think you'll see that there are a number of ways to describe either a problem or a why or a reason for being without using without referencing deficit language, right? So another factor to consider is that you hopefully should be, if you're working with either under-resourced communities or marginalized communities, hopefully you are actually working with them and they are part of your organization to help develop this language, right? And so just like in the case of Justice Defenders, I'll go back. This was an organization that was made up of both people inside and outside of prison. And so when we came up with this language, we were trying to figure out what's the best word. And, we were talking with their paralegals in prisons to define themselves as defenseless. And then the people in prison kind of twisted that around and said, yes, we are defenseless, but we are also defenders of the defenseless. And so this was a beautiful example of using language with our communities and developing the language with our communities instead of for our communities, right? And so I think that's one of the core principles here. The other thing to note in this example is the why, the problem statement here. It's actually a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, because there can be no peace without justice and no justice without peace, right? That's not deficit language about the community. That's showing why justice matters within a society. I'm thinking back to, like, you can use data points. We had a client that worked with like community health workers, a very under-resourced community, and they just used some data. They showed that 70% of community health workers are not salaried and supplied, right? And so that was the problem statement. It wasn't deficit language about the community or the people. It was about the issue itself. So hopefully that can really help.
Thank you. We've also got another question from Mark.
Yep.
Just again, I think on that first law, what kind of problems do you see arts organizations naming at the
Yep.
top of their pitch?
Totally. Yeah. So if it's a specific arts organization around, like for instance, my experience with Austin City Limits, it really grew out of the kind of Americana and roots world. And it was really a kind of a dying art form and form of music when we were working, or when I worked there. And the problem statement for them would have been, roots and Americana music is dying. People don't appreciate it like they used to, right? And so that was a core problem that we were trying to solve by launching the festival and bringing these artists that were kind of underexposed. You could have if you're an organization that's maybe serving children with arts, it could be, children these days are addicted to their devices and don't have enough time, using their hands. Therefore we offer sculpting classes, right? I mean, there's so many different problem statements to kind of show why this work matters. And so those are two examples. It could be that a form of art is dying. It could be that children are on their devices. It could be as communities we're increasingly isolated and we need festivals to come together to have a sense of community, right? There's so many ways we can kind of pitch a donor on why this work matters instead of, again, just jumping straight into what we do.
Beautiful. Thank you for those examples. I think that's really helped. There were some earlier questions just in relation to brand and
Yep.
funding. There's been a question from Sylvia. As a writer, can I have a brand?
Yeah, I mean, even if you're a solo writer, whether it's poetry or a book, yes, of course, you are the brand at that point, right? So maybe you have a book series that is your brand, but then you as the writer and as the author are the brand, right? That's actually something really important to note in all of this is that whether you're a full nonprofit organization or an individual, generally on social media and email marketing and other forms of communications, people follow people more than they follow organizations. And so, Sylvia, you actually have a great unfair advantage. You, as the writer, are the brand. And so people following you and interacting with you is very powerful.
Brilliant. Thank you for that one. And then there's just a final question in the chat, just in clarification around the use of the word funding. Does this include both philanthropy and partnerships, or are we narrowing that scope to the philanthropic space?
Yeah, thanks for that. So when we refer to funding, we refer to probably five main sorts of funding. And so there's government funding, there's trusts and foundations and institutions, there are high net worth individuals, that would give big gifts. There are small givers that would maybe give, $10 online. And then there are corporate partners with corporate funding. And so I don't know if by partnerships you mean corporate partnerships, but yes, corporate partners can also be a fabulous way to achieve funding. I say in the book, and it's not part of today's talk, but corporate partners can also be much more than funding. And so partnerships can also be funding and a brand megaphone.
Terrific. Thank you. I think that clarifies that. There's been a question from Jill. The Q&A doesn't seem to be working for Jill. Jill, and those who have also raised this. The way that the Q&A is functioning is that we are seeing all of your questions, and so I am, as you can see, I'm sort of like I'm on the road here on the I'm reporting back from the chat. If you do have a question, Jill, feel free to pop it into the chat. We can definitely see your responses there, and I'm sort of just synthesizing those as they go along throughout the session. So please absolutely do use that Q&A function. I think there was another question earlier in the session about that. So hopefully that's clarified that. There's another one from Mitchell, and I think this is just about the difference between independent practice and organizations. So Mitchell said, organizations feel larger than myself as an independent creative. I practice a few different modalities: illustration, acting, filmmaking, and writing. When putting branding online, would this be multiple websites or branding per skill set, or one consolidated brand and site?
Yeah, Mitchell, it'd probably take more conversation to give you a great answer, but I think we would generally say a single brand is for really a group of people or a couple of groups of people, and a single brand does a thing or a couple of things. Most of us are not Apple or Coca-Cola that has lots of products for lots of people, right? At this size, a single brand should generally be a thing for a group of people. And so let's say you do illustration for schools, and then you do acting for for another group of people, and then you do filmmaking. If it's for different audiences and different things, then yes, at that point you would probably have different brands, kind of even different possible websites, who knows? But if it's kind of all under your creative umbrella, then possibly just you as a brand. So probably a million ways to answer that, but hopefully that helps.
Beautiful, thank you. I think that is it for the chat, so I'll hand back over to you for the
Great.
next section.
Great. Yeah, let's keep it coming. Thanks. Thanks for all the questions. This is awesome. This is what we want it to be, interactive. All right, so let's move on to the second part of today's talk, which is be findable. So being findable means to occupy a distinct space in the minds of your ideal funders, and then routinely communicate your promises, your brand promises. So this is also your brand, and this can also fix your fundraising. And just like being fundable, there are three main laws of being findable. So the first law of being findable is that difference equals donations. So emphasize it. All right, so little show and tell here. I want you to imagine a supermarket aisle full of green apples, just like these. Can you imagine like 1,000, 10,000 in a big grocery store aisle? So right in the middle of the supermarket aisle is a single red apple. Which one gets your attention? Easy. Which one is the best quality? Debatable. That's why in fundraising, different beats better, because being a unique brand is subjective. It's hard to argue, right? But being a superior brand is, being a unique brand is objective. It's hard to argue. But being a superior brand is subjective. It's in the eye of the beholder. You may be better, perhaps even best, but it's not the same as different. And so I always say, don't be the best, be the only. Why, might you ask? Well, all humans, including donors, are wired for comparison, especially since there's a lot of overlap. Whether it's looking at the global nonprofit world or the arts scene in Australia, many of us do the same work. And so this overlap and then these mental comparisons can lead to donor doubt. So maybe a funder thinks, okay, yet another music festival, or a funder thinks, yet another, arts nonprofit, right? They kind of start to see a lot of the same thing. It's actually the second biggest complaint we hear from donors. So remember back to the being fundable. The first thing is they just don't understand what you do. And then the second thing we hear from donors is they just don't understand how you're different from everybody else they already fund. So I want you to check out these three nonprofits. These are all American nonprofits. They all work in the exact same field. You might even say they have the exact same mission, right? If we go back to that mission and that one sentence theory of change, but they have all positioned themselves very differently and very well. So Susan G. Komen, they're feminine, active, positive. F Cancer, a real nonprofit. They're young, they're rebellious, they're angry. American Cancer Society, academic, trusted, and corporate. It's great, right? All I showed you was a quick photo and a logo. I didn't tell you anything about them, but you got a sense of who they're for. You got a sense of who they're for not, right? Or who they're not for, right? So American Cancer Society, that probably appeals to my mom. F Cancer, that would repel my mom, and that's okay, right? A good brand turns off as many people as it turns on. That's okay. You want to be able to communicate that with nothing but your photos and a little bit of a feeling. And so back to that question earlier of kind of can you describe a brand? Just with a photo and a logo there, I was able to really kind of give you a feeling without anything else. So I want to give you another tool, and this can help you determine what makes you unique. So the first thing is to think about what your community needs. And so this is back to that problem statement or the why, the reason for being. So what does your community need in the first place? Then, of course, you have to look at what you're good at. And so this is more or less your mission. What skills do you have internally? Of course, you have to look at the fundraising realities. What are funders, supporting these days, right? And that is an important component. I think some of us will get these first three, but what we often don't do is layer on what others aren't doing, right? These are the gaps and the noise in the landscape. And so if you can find that intersection in the middle, you've at that point nailed your ideal positioning. So again, take a picture, remember this mental model. That's such powerful positioning. You could read books and go to courses on positioning strategy, but it's honestly those four things. What does your community need in the first place? What are you good at? What can you get paid for? And what are other people maybe not doing? Finding that intersection is powerful. If the astute listeners in this knowledge series would recognize this from the Japanese concept of ikigai, it's really meant to be about people and kind of how to find your purpose in life, but we use it to work the same with brands, right? This is almost like a tool to help you find your brand purpose as well. So hopefully that will help. Determine what makes you unique and then communicate it. That's the first law of being findable. Difference equals donations. So emphasize it. All right, the second law of being findable is that diversified funding is a nonprofit nemesis. And so many of you might hear this and you say, gasp, this goes against everything we're taught, right? As fundraisers, as nonprofit leaders, we're often taught to diversify and to build that donor pyramid. And we need all different types of donors, big and small, right? Those 5 types I mentioned. We need high net worths, we need small givers, we need corporate givers, we need government partners, we need foundations. However, it's time to bust that myth. Because the truth is, of course, diversified fundraising helps you survive early on. There's no doubt. And some might argue that it's the safest route if you just want to stay small. So if there are a few of you out there that were in that small size, that even kind of tiny size that Australia Charities Report mentioned, if you just want to stay small, you just need to raise a few $100,000 per year, diversified funding might be your ticket. But the big nuance here, and the reason I call it a nemesis, is because diversified funding gets you to a certain point, but then you get stuck, you get trapped. That's the challenge. It's actually not how you get big. It's not how you get to the next level. So let this sink in. Remember at the beginning, in the intro, I shared about those 1 in 1,000 nonprofits that reached 50 million in annual budget, that broke beyond the small business size. Well, researchers from the Bridgespan Group, they studied these nonprofits over a 40-year period, and they actually tried to figure out, okay, how did they break through? These were unicorn nonprofits. What happened? And so they published a report. It's called The Myth of Diversification. You can go check it out. And what they found was that among these big nonprofits, 90% of them had a dominant funding type. And that type of funding accounted for 90% of their total funding. And so to be clear, we're talking about a type of funding such as individual donors, foundations, corporations, governments, Or for many of you, and for many of them in this study, service fees or customer fees or ticket sales, right? That earned revenue can also be a type of funding. But these big nonprofits didn't have various sources of funding. And so the idea here is it's okay if you don't want to grow. Not all of us need to grow, right? Many of us are happy being small. We just need to serve a small community, raise a little bit of money every year. That's okay. Possibly diversified funding is the ticket. But if you've gotten to a certain point and you're stuck, you have to eventually muster the courage to put all of your eggs in one basket. And to be clear, again, we're not talking about a single funder. I think many of you have seen the worldwide ripple effects and the implications of US aid pulling out of $40 billion of aid worldwide. I would never say only go after US aid, but if US aid type big funding is your ticket, then you would have US aid and you would have Australian government aid and you would have DFID and other forms of aid that would kind of round out your fundraising portfolio. So that's the real idea here. Boards can pressure leaders to pursue diversification. We know you also get a lot of pressure from your boards, but Jane Liu says you need to encourage the right kind of diversification, which is more funders in a primary source. This is from Jane. She's the CEO of a great fundraising firm out of the Philippines. It's called Smarter Good, and she echoes the same advice. And so what this means in positioning strategy terms, so this is kind of the theory, but what does it mean to you? Well, you have to narrow your priority audiences. So again, nonprofits feel like, well, we can target individual small donors through social media, and then we can go after high net worth through galas and events, and then we can go write grant applications to the government and foundations, but it's just not possible. We say you have to at least pick, 3 max, a primary audience, and then a couple of secondary audiences. Because you just like the question earlier about how many websites, most of the time you have one website, one brand, one set of communications, and it's impossible to reach all those different donors at the same time if you want to grow significantly. So narrow the audiences for your brand, because the second law of being findable is that diversified funding is a nonprofit nemesis. All right, third and final law of being findable is that brands that chase all channels chase away funding. And we hear it all the time. You hear the term omni-channel marketing. People telling you all the marketing tactics to reach donors, telling you the more communications channels are better. You might have seen this graphic. If you haven't, we didn't make it up. You can go look it up. It's called PESO, P-E-S-O, and it stands for paid, earned, shared, and owned. And if you're a big brand, again, if you're Apple or Coca-Cola or Toyota, sure. Or maybe if you're an international NGO with hundreds of millions in budget, sure, you might be able to really use all of these different marketing channels. But for most smaller nonprofits, most of you in this room and most of us, the truth is most of this MarCom is just noise. So tune it out. What's the fix? We call it the minimalist communications playbook. And we say, if you're small and you're just getting started with marketing communications, you should start with a 10-slide pitch deck. Have that pitch deck ready for possibly high net worth donors, or if you're sitting down at a coffee shop with a partner and you want to show them more about your work, have a 10-slide pitch deck to start. Have a 5-page website. Even if you end up building more, at least start with that. A 3-line elevator pitch. Anyone, anywhere who asks what you do, you should be able to tell them the same thing over and over and over again. Why you exist, what you do, and where you're going. Everyone on your team should have that same elevator pitch. And then a monthly email newsletter. No podcasts, no video, no ads, no speeches, no events, not until you do this basic stuff well, because you can do all 4 of these for cheap or free, and combined, you can raise millions in funding. And so for most of us, your communications team is either non-existent or small or stretched thin. And so until these 4 marketing assets are 100% optimized, just ignore everything else. Remember, brands that focus on fundamentals find the funds. So focus here, get started with just a few core elements. Then once you're becoming more findable, what do you do then? What do you add? We recommend 2 channels. So going back to that PESO model, you pick a primary channel, and then you can choose a secondary channel to augment the primary channel. For example, you might say that, hey, for our patrons, for our customers, for our donors, email marketing is the primary channel. Great. Then you might say, all right, hosting, events and galas and, kind of black tie dinners for high net worths. That's our secondary channel. Great. That's your focus. Or you might say that our number one channel is, social media, just because that's where we reach the young people on TikTok. Great. And then your secondary channel might be TV ads, right? You really do have to focus in the early days. Here's a little bit more encouragement from a marketing pro, Christina. She says, you are everywhere, but you don't have to be. Strategy is a decision to take a path to say no. So optimize your website and then two channels, because the third and final law of being findable is that brands that chase all channels chase away funding. So in summary, to be findable, just remember, difference equals donations. Emphasize it. Be that red apple. Diversified funding is a nonprofit nemesis, and brands that chase all channels chase away funding. Stand out and stand clear. All right, so just like being fundable, how might you bring these three laws together? Obviously, going and doing a full positioning strategy is ideal. Doing a full marketing communications plan is ideal. But for now, here's another final simple tool you can use. Many of you here might say, I don't have any formal marketing strategy. You don't have to overdo it. Here's a simple one-sentence formula. Just like the previous one, here's another simple one-sentence formula. Unlike competitors, you might not like that word competitors, so you might say peer organizations or other organizations, whatever you say here. These are the others that are in your sphere. We are three uniques. And so these are those three differentiators we talked about that maybe nobody else can say. We reach main audience. So this is that most important single audience of those three targets. You might have three priority audiences, but you probably have one that's most important, like government donors or foundations or individual donors. And we reach them through two channels. These are those two main marketing channels. Remember, all that peso is noise, but you can pick two channels. And then in order to goal. We didn't cover this specifically, but this is what you're trying to accomplish with your marketing, like ticket sales, online donations. Maybe it's participant signups. Maybe it's a free workshop. Maybe it's recruiting volunteers. There are so many different marketing goals you can have. But if you weave this sentence together, again, you have more of a marketing strategy than many have today. All right, so here's an example, just like in the previous exercise. Same organization in Kenya, unlike free legal aid NGOs. We are comprised of defenseless communities. We provide legal education and focus on criminal justice. Great, that's their three uniques. And we reach high net worths. That's their main audience via email marketing and speaking. So for them, their founder was an excellent public speaker. So that was a main marketing channel for them in order to build a base of multi-year unrestricted funding. So this is their one sentence marketing strategy. And sure, it's clunky, kind of like that previous sentence. It's not supposed to be public facing messaging. It's supposed to drive that internal clarity. And it's probably more of a strategy than many of us have before. All right, so now we have those two new one-liners. Hopefully you have the knowledge and the tools to be more fundable and findable than ever before. Let's stop for a couple of quick questions before we wrap up. And then I'll tell you how that story ended for the nonprofit in Kenya.
Thanks, Kevin. We've just looking through the chat here, we've got a question here on the first law, and to one of the elements of the Ikigai adapted positioning statement in relation to what funders will support. And the question is, to what extent do we or should we follow funding trends or what funders will support? For instance, these days, there's an example here about funders shifting focus to climate change, and should an art collective promoting healing for women survivors of gender-based violence put elements of climate into their programming proposal to get funded? So how far are we shifting mission or our programming and activities to what funders will support is the question there.
Yeah, thank you, Segdia. Great question. I love this because to a certain extent, you have to pay attention to funding trends, but you should not let that kind of jerk you around. It should not be the lead. Sadly, it is, right? You mentioned, climate, for instance, which obviously a few years ago became just a hot topic, right? And everyone was greenwashing and everyone was trying to figure out ways that their interventions fit within climate. And, sadly, I think a lot of it was maybe a little bit disingenuous. You would see a organization that was building and running a school, but then they would say, well, we're also climate adaptive because we have a solar panel, therefore we want this climate funding. And it just wasn't a fit. And so I think you saw at that point their messaging became weaker, even though they were paying attention to the funding trends. And so what I would say is use that Ikigai tool to make sure funding trends are one of the considerations, but only maybe a fourth, 25% of your considerations, right? Rooting it in what your community needs first, then what you're good at, what others aren't doing, and fundraising realities, right? That gives it a fair balance. That gives it a healthy amount of balance. You have to watch those funding trends, but you also have to balance those other three elements. I can give you an example of this example I've been weaving throughout the presentation. This organization that we worked with in Kenya, when we met them, they believed that foundations and trusts, they don't want to fund justice. We're only going to have to go after high net worths. This is just not something they really fund. And we looked at the data and we saw that there was a ton of money out there, and we believed that you just didn't have the right brand story. You were telling one story to individual donors and one story, it was convoluted. And the real art of messaging is kind of overlapping your brand story with that audience intersection. Remember, I mentioned earlier, once we nailed the brand, institutions and trusts and that foundation funding went through the roof. And so they were really wrong about it, and they were letting that kind of dictate what they did and didn't do. But really, once we got to their core brand, that kind of allowed a lot of new funding to take off.
Thank you for that. This sort of leads us to Law 2, diversified funding is a non-profit nemesis, which is quite controversial in the chat, I have to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've got a couple of different questions here. One of them is in regards to when a funder, for example, a government funder, really values diversified funding streams. And a sort of second part to that from a different person. What happens when a primary funder, for instance, a government, uh, pulls out from funding the activity? Doesn't diversified funding help protect against that?
Yeah, so if there's a partner of yours pushing for diversified funding, I mean, maybe this is not for this webinar, but I would say it's a little bit none of their business. It's harder to tell a funder that, but they should be, if they believe in you, they should be investing and letting you kind of run your organization the way you see fit. All that aside, yeah, that's where it's a trade-off. There's no one right or wrong answer. You might say, hey, we have this big pot of government funding. They're really going to force us to have, a third or more of diversified funding. Therefore, we kind of have to. The truth is, though, at that point, it might be hard, and the data shows it's going to be hard for you to grow significantly. And so that's really where there are trade-offs. Do you get to the point where you can say no to that government funding if you go after, a primary source of funding somewhere else? Maybe. There are certainly trade-offs with all of this, and that's why I say it's a nemesis. Carrie and I had asked in the chat, thank you for Carrie. Yeah, a large arts organization had a massive government contract. It was unexpectedly pulled, and they were stuck. And so the idea here is not to rely on a single funder. That's the big takeaway. You would never just rely on that one massive funder. You would have lots of funders in that category so that if one pulled out, you would be able to fall back on the others. So that's the idea here behind it being a nemesis. Again, diversified funding, we all have to do it, right? In the early days, you just take what you can get. And then you get to this point where whether you're 550,000 in size or 500,000 in size or 5 million in size, you get to this point where it's really hard to break through the next level being diversified. So that's why I say nemesis, right? The definition is like, it's almost like a good thing that you can't break out of, and it's complicated. And so there's going to have to be a lot of trade-offs there.
And I think as well, thinking about the scope of private sector support, I guess, looking at trust and foundations, individual donors, and corporate sponsorships, if we're starting out, perhaps not pursuing all three of those different strategies, but perhaps focusing on one of them is the point there for that private sector focus. Is that correct?
Totally, yeah. And the truth is, you also don't have to just all of a sudden turn away funding or all of a sudden just tell previous donors no. But the idea is you get to a certain point and you really decide, okay, which funding type gives us the best chance for success? And then you lean into that for your brand. So, we have clients that say, all right, look, we have all these high net worths. They know us, they love us, they're going to fund us regardless of what our brand is. Let's keep them going, but let's really focus the brand on big government grants. Great. You're still keeping those high net worths in the background. Again, you're not telling them no. It's just that you're focusing the brand in order to really attract those government grants. The challenge is we see clients that they're trying to go after government grants and foundations, yet they have a donate button on their website saying donate $10 for Mother's Day. And it just doesn't make sense from a brand standpoint. So that becomes the challenge.
Beautiful, thank you. And I guess in extending from that, there was also a question about whether or not an organization needs to um, go back to diversified funding once they reach a plateau after pursuing perhaps one of those strategies. Is there anything that you can add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly wise, and that's part of brand building and fundraising is it's experimenting. You're oftentimes, hey, will this message attract this type of funding? Will this brand attract this type of donor? And you are experimenting to find that sweet spot. And so I think there is wisdom in, hey, we've tried this path, we've plateaued, we don't think this brand and this message and this fundraising strategy is correct. What if we shifted, right? So I think over time, as funding trends change, as your community needs change, you're constantly going back to that grid. What does our community need? What are we good at? What are the funding realities? What others aren't doing? It's a constantly moving target. I'm not saying you change your brand and funding strategy every 6 months or even year, but possibly every 12 to 18 months, 2 years, you're really thinking about, is this still the brand for us? Is this still the fundraising strategy for us?
Perfect, thank you. There's one here from Kim. What are some key tricks to understand whether a potential funder is a match for my not-for-profit?
Ooh, that's a great question. That starts to get into a little bit more of like the one-on-one fundraising versus the brand building to attract funding. I'm going to say that's slightly outside of the scope of my expertise in this kind of conversation, because that's really more of like a sales thing, right? So if it's a particular funder and you're trying to figure out if they're right for you, I think that's where it stops being a brand and a fun, like a messaging opportunity, and more of like a sales and a fundraising conversation opportunity. And that's where there are countless great fundraising firms to help you figure out that potential fit. And that's where Mighty Ally kind of overlaps. Like we're kind of building the brand and teaching you how to kind of do the one to many. And then that one to one is really more about the traditional art of fundraising, if that makes sense. So Smarter Good and other great fundraising firms would be a better fit
Beautiful, thank
for
you.
questions like that.
There is a specific one from Melinda, and I think we just it's just going back to the sentence. Um,
Yeah,
so in the sentence, the main audience isn't the people helping with the organization, but the donors. There's just a bit of confusion there. If you wouldn't mind just revisiting that section, just so we can consolidate that
perfect.
before we
Yep.
lose you, if that's okay.
Perfect. Yep. And then we'll probably do the conclusion and see how much time we have for the final questions. But yes, thank you, Melinda. Great question. So in this marketing strategy, the main audience is often correct, not those that you work with or that you help or you serve. It sometimes can be, but often this is more the donor audience or the government partner for the brand. That one sentence theory of change earlier is those you serve, those you work with. And look, in the arts world, it's often the same, right? You might have a patron who's also the donor. You might be selling tickets to a concert series and also going back to them a few months later and asking for donations. And so it can sometimes be the same, but often with nonprofits, it's different.
Beautiful. Thank you for revisiting that. I'll hand back over to you, Kevin.
Perfect. We'll wrap up and see how much time we have for Q&A, including a great question from Sadia around how do we access more? I love that question. But before we do that, let's wrap up. So remember, I promised to tell you how things wrapped up for that Kenyan nonprofit, right? And so it started with the tough love, the tough reality, when that high net worth donor told them that their brand was shit. Well, the nonprofit leader, he pulled an epic power move. And so he told the donor, why don't you put your money where your mouth is and pay for us to make the brand better? Which was epic, right? We cheered, we loved that, right? It was striking that power imbalance and right to the core. And so, which was great. The donor helped us work with our client justice defenders And so we helped them over the course of many months, become fundable and findable. It started with that new theory of change. We went through their strategic plan, a new positioning strategy, a new marketing communications mix. It included a new name, new visual identity, new website, and more. But it's important to note all the new visuals and the branding and the messaging and the website, that came later, right? We had to fix the brand strategy first. And then, as you can see in the top middle, we helped the Justice Defender story reach millions of people worldwide with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes, which is America's #1 news program. So really, at that point, every element of the brand worked in unison. And so I could ask you to put in the chat, what do you think happened? But I think it's pretty obvious at that point, fundraising flourished. So we broke the annual online donations record by 2,000% in just 5 weeks. So these were some amazing online gifts. 166 new donors joined the High Net Worth Giving Club. A few months later, Mackenzie Scott, who many of you know has just been giving away money like Oprah and making it rain the last few years, she gave them $4 million. And then best of all, the donor who started this whole story with his tough love, well, upon seeing the new brand, he gave $1.5 million and became a long-term supporter. So we loved that. It ended so perfectly. So there you have it. That's how to get funding. And so now I have one call to action for you. So before we leave today, hopefully you have seen that if your funding has stalled, stop that fundraising rat race, the old school hamster wheel of chasing donations, gather your leadership team, and don't leave the room until you're fundable and findable. As I've said, brand first, funding second. At least you can get started with those 2 exercises I shared today. And at this point, you might be thinking, oh, we're busy, we're running our programs. How do we do this? I promise it's not that complicated. And you can do it. If you do it, if you turn these ideas into action, in the short term, you'll feel aligned internally, which means operating with more clarity and confidence. And in the long term, you'll feel amplified externally, meaning you'll be speaking and using a louder, sharper voice, which will lead to ultimately maximized fundraising. So here's a final reminder from Jeff Brooks, who I shared a quote with earlier. This is a great summary of what it means for you in the arts world. Almost all arts donors are arts buyers first. People who appreciate the art and want it to stay available for their own quality of life and then for the other good things it does. And they're willing to pay for it. They know you and you know them because they want your art in their lives. So here's the thing. If you want people to donate to the arts, you need to remind them how meaningful it is for them. Just telling them your artists are superb and the art is important, that's not why they give. They give because they know what it means to them and secondarily what it means to other people. So hopefully that's a good little bit of reinforcement and encouragement, because the truth is time is ticking. Our communities need more of us. So be fundable, be findable, be unstoppable. You've got this. And a quick answer before we wrap up to Sekdia, who asks, where can I find more of your trainings, classes, workshops, both in person and online? Also, how to purchase your books and subscribe to your channel's newsletter. This is perfect. I should pay you after this for teeing up that question. So I just wrote a book. Matt mentioned it earlier. It just launched in April, so we're just at it, which is exciting. It's called Fundable and Findable, the brand new way to fix your nonprofit fundraising. It's been a bestseller in 4 categories. It currently has a 5-star rating, which is awesome. And you can get it at fundablefindable.org. So that's the book. And then a special thing we're doing in June for the first time ever, we're actually opening up our live training program. We've never done this before. This is a part of our work where funders typically hire us for their portfolios. So they typically say, hey, we have 10 or 20 or 30 organizations we need you to work with. And so for the first time in June, we're actually opening it up for anyone, anywhere to access. And so you'll see that on our website, mightyally.org/blog/live training. I don't know if I can put that in the chat, but I'll do my best here in a second. But yeah, that's a special opportunity that's starting June 2nd, actually. And so we're only taking 10 organizations and it's open for enrollment now. And that is a wrap, other than the final questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kevin, for all of your insights and your frameworks. I think the thing that I love about your work is the way that you package things into really actionable bite-sized pieces for us to go away and sort of start doing some work straight away. So thank you for that. What we'll do now, we've got 10 minutes left in the session, and would like to open up the floor to some questions. So if you do have any questions, please, everyone's very familiar with that Q&A function now. Drop them into the chat, and we will do our best to answer them. Lots of comments saying what an uplifting webinar, lots of light bulbs firing from people. Fabulous. Thanks, everyone. It's so good to hear that feedback. Do you have a mentoring program? Is a question.
So as part of this live training in June, it does come with 4 hours of coaching time. So it's like a one-on-one mentoring coaching. So that's currently the only way to access it is through this training program. Otherwise, it's more of like in our bigger consulting engagements. That's when we do our kind of one-on-one mentoring. But this live training program that's on the screen is it's not only 4 hours of live workshops, it's 4 hours of one-on-one coaching, a bunch of tools and templates, peer learning, and you get a copy of our online course at the same time.
Terrific. There's one here, just in relation to boards. How do we engage boards in this process?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Hannah asked it, and I think someone asked it earlier. So thank you, Hannah. Yeah, so I would say it depends. Many of us have boards that are a little more hands-off and a little more regulatory. You know, we at Mighty Ally have a nonprofit ourselves, right? We're a nonprofit hybrid. We have a small board. They're not as hands-on. And so in that case, I would say probably don't engage them in this process. You know, they really at that point should trust you as the nonprofit leaders to build your brand, to tell your story. You know, they should be in an informed mode. You might have seen that matrix, RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. If they're more hands-off, inform them about what you're doing. If they're hands-on, especially if you have like a founder that then became a board member, definitely get them involved in this process. You know, from day one, tell them, hey, we're working on our brand. This is deep stuff. You know, just like the soul of an individual, the identity, this is the identity of the organization. And we need you, you know, if you're going to be approving these decisions later, you need to be involved in this process. And tell them, hey, there's nothing worse than us doing weeks or months worth of work and coming back to you to show you what we've done, and then you poo-pooing all over it, for lack of better words, for lack of graceful words. So I think at that point, tell them you have to be involved or get out of the way and trust us.
Beautiful, thank you. There's a question here just in relation to the theory of change and the one sentence theory of change that you spoke about. Do we need to have a full-blown theory of change for our organization to translate into that one sentence theory of change? Or perhaps if we've got a strategic plan, is the one sentence a good place to start?
Totally. I mean, you can start with that one sentence without anything else. Like, in fact, most organizations, especially in the arts world, don't have a formal theory of change because sometimes it's not as much about, you know, again, sometimes, and many of you have asked about, you know, maybe under-resourced communities, showing me that some of you do work with you know, organizations and populations that, you know, are, you know, fighting maybe poverty, hunger, health, education, inequality, et cetera. Regardless of what you have and don't have, that one sentence is a great start. This question about articulating the problem, an anonymous attendee says, is creating great Australian art because there isn't enough of it? Is that a good enough problem? Yeah, sure. I think continue developing it, make it sound, you know, more compelling, more urgent. But yeah, if you feel like possibly in your community, maybe there's no live music venue, or maybe there's no arts in your community and there's not enough of it, and that is the problem. Great. Say that compellingly. Maybe it's a form of art that's suffering or dying and there's not enough of it. Great, say that. Totally. That's a perfect problem. That all we're trying to do is, again, without deficit language, we're just trying to tee up why this matters. Why should someone listen? Why should they take notice? Why should they fund you? Oh, because of this problem I'm describing.
Terrific. Thank you for that. Kim has asked, when I get my leadership team together in response to your webinar, what is
Ah,
a provocative opening statement I can make to generate enthusiasm?
ooh, great question. I mean, I would start with kind of what I started with today is, do we feel like fundraising is working? Do we feel like we're happy with the status quo? Do we feel like things are clicking? Do we feel like donors get our story and fund us fully? Are we happy with where we are? That's maybe even a question for your board. My guess is based on all the responses at the beginning when I said, do you feel unseen, unheard, and underfunded? My guess is your leadership team would say, no, we're not happy. Something's not working. And so I think at that point, you can introduce, well, why don't we do something differently, right? Going back to the book title, it's a brand new way to fix your nonprofit fundraising. That's the whole idea here is for decades, if not centuries, we've been trying to fundraise with some of these old donor-centric traditions and tactics, and something's not working. So yeah, Kim, I would say, is everything working or do we want to try something different for once?
Beautiful, thank you. And just on the book, so you've taken us through 6 laws,
Yeah.
but in the book there's 20. Is there
Yeah.
a particular law that you think is the one that's going to generate a huge light bulb or anything that was not covered in today's session that you can
Hmm.
articulate synthesize into a bite-sized piece?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think one of them that gets the most reaction is, the first step in fundraising is not fundraising, right? And so it's that idea that, all right, we're ready to fundraise, but don't just go do fundraising the old way, right? So that's a whole law in the book. There's one called fundraising starts with boards and teams, not tactics. So there's a whole chapter in the book around why really everyone in your organization has to be committed to fundraising. So there's a framework I give in the book for getting your board and your team to either be advocates or ambassadors or askers. And so there's a whole methodology there. So yeah, there's a few of those laws.
Yeah,
Liz asked, yeah, actually it can be printed in Australia. Amazon's amazing. They have these print centers around the world. And if you just go to Amazon AU, there's actually they print in Australia. We have a ton of people in Australia that have already received their books within a couple of days because it prints locally.
beautiful, thank you. I think we've got a couple of questions here. One from Anna. It's difficult to stay the course and trust the initial strategy. How long until um, it is apparent that things aren't working? Is
Mm.
enough encouragement, but not many walking the walk? I would
Yeah.
have a tendency to often want to change directions ever so slightly.
Yeah. So thank you, Anna, for this. It is difficult. Yeah, when funding's not coming in, it is. It's hard to stay the course. That's why we do believe that brand building is more like a science. So think about when we learned about science in schools, it was setting hypotheses. It was experimenting. It was learning from our mistakes and then constantly tweaking to find the right formula, right? That's really brand building. And so I can't give you a perfect number of how long, but once you set a strategy, once you set a brand, it's definitely months, if not a year or two of learning. We at Mighty Ally, we do this for hundreds of clients around the world, and we've probably had 5 or 6 different versions of our own brand strategy in the last 8 years. Every year or two, we're thinking, all right, what if we tweaked this little piece? And what if we changed that word? So you're constantly iterating and learning. But that's also, I know it's hard, but that's also what makes it fun. It's not supposed to be perfect. In fact, the final chapter in my book, it's the conclusion. It says, imperfect brands make perfect sense because it's not supposed to be perfect. And so if you kind of relieve yourself of it working right away, get out there and tinker with it like a scientist and try to have fun with it and see what you can unlock when you kind of take some of that pressure off.
Brilliant. Thank you. And what a wonderful note to end on. Um, Kevin, thank you. Thank you again. I can just see the flurry of activity in the chat here. I think you've really connected with everyone today and set off
Great.
so many light bulbs. So thank you for joining us today.
Awesome.
For our audience, if you have enjoyed today's session and would like to revisit it, it will be available, the recording will be available to watch back on Creative Australia's YouTube channel in a couple of weeks' time. And also on our YouTube channel are the previous knowledge series sessions for this year, including two sessions on AI and one on thanking and stewardship. So if you'd like to further your fundraising learning online, you can watch those back. Our back catalogue is also making its way to YouTube. But in the meantime, if you are interested in particular topics such as sponsorship or fundraising leadership, you can reach out to the team at Creative Australia via an email address, cpa.programs@creative.gov.au, and request those. And as always, the network of state manager development partnerships um, are here to support you through fundraising, coaching, and advice. So if there have been any light bulb moments throughout today's session, and like Kim, you're wondering what's next, we're all going to be available to meet with you either online or in person or over the phone to help digest and work out what might be next for you as an individual or an organization. Thank you very much for joining us today. Have a lovely afternoon. Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.